and welcome to another edition of ISA's Bookshelf, a podcast brought to you by Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. In this podcast, we chat with authors about their books on South Asian politics, economy, and society. Today, we are discussing Toward a Free Economy, Swatantra and Opposition Politics in Democratic India. This book is a history of the rise of economic conservatism as an intellectual and political force in independent India. It traces that rise by retelling the story of Swatantra Party, one of the major opposition parties in Indian politics. It is a really fantastic work on history of economic thought in India, and it has received many accolades to reflect that. It was shortlisted for the Elder Prize, the W.K. Hancock Prize, as well as longlisted for the Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay Prize. To discuss the book, we are fortunate to have its author, Dr. Aditya Balasubramanian. He is a senior lecturer in history at the Australian National University. His focus is political, economic, and environmental history of India, and this is his first book. And in my opinion, he's doing some of the most interesting research in economic history of South and Southeast Asia for the last few years. Aditya, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Sandeep. That's immensely generous of you to say. It's such a pleasure to be on the ISAS bookshelf, to be on the proverbial bookshelf. And also, I had the opportunity to visit ISAS a couple of years ago and meet with Iqbal and everybody. So it's a great particular honor to be connected to ISAS again. So I'm really looking forward to this. This is the book. I've unblurred my background because I feel comfortable with you all. Okay, so thank you. Looking forward.
Yeah, thank you for the vote of confidence. So let me start by asking you a basic overview of the party itself, the Swatantra Party, because even though, as your book demonstrates, it was a very potent force of its time, very potent political force of its time, but I think many of our listeners may not have a very concrete idea of what it was, or at least I must admit that before I read your book, I had a very vague idea of what this party was. So before we get into the weeds, could you lay out what the party was and why is it important to study it?
Yeah. And before that, what I'd like to do actually is to take a step back because, one of the things that comes up is that when you talk to people, when I've been privileged to be in conversation about the book, they kind of read this as a kind of history of Swatantra Party. And of course, the book is a history of the Swatantra Party in some respects, but it is and it isn't, right? So the motivation for this project and the interest in this project, or where this comes from, is to try to understand the longer roots of liberalization in Indian society, the economic liberalization of 1991, but to think about it as something that rather than a distinct break in 1991, which is what the growth figures will show you, this is a kind of mode of consensus around development that has long been developing since the 50s. Right, or it's been it originates in the 50s from the birth of the Indian Republic. So that is broadly what we're trying to understand. And the idea is, if you want to understand Indian political economy today, one of the things that you have to understand is the fall of the Congress. The second one of the other things you have to understand liberalization. And put it in kind of historical context. So that is broadly the motivation for the book. The Swatantra Party's rise and fall in the heyday of the Nehruvian period. So it kind of is founded in 1959. Nehru dies in 64. Swatantra experiences its greatest success in 1967 when it wins 46 seats in the Lok Sabha in the elections that year and forms the formal opposition in Andhra Pradesh, Rajasthan and Gujarat, and it becomes it forms a coalition government in Orissa for a brief period of time. And then by 1971, after this kind of split in the Congress into Congress Indira Gandhi and Congress O, the Congress O figures kind of take the Swatantra Party's vote banks with them. Party founder is kind of on his last legs. General secretary is quit. And it sort of disintegrates. So that's broadly what Swatantra is. Why is Swatantra important? To an extent, sure, because of this electoral interlude. But broadly, as a vehicle of understanding, developing ideas about political economy and how that reflects changes that are taking places in Indian economy and society, right? As well as powerful ideas about what is the role of an opposition in a democracy, right? So this is about, in some senses, the development of capitalism and communities in South Asia, right? This is about the development of democracy, India's historic experiment to extend universal franchise. And it's also about that Nehruvian period itself. And so the idea is that you want to open up a new view of that period by looking at its critics, by looking at the people who are trying to unseat those who are in power. And that has been done to some extent from the left, but think about it from the right as well. And it is also about trying to understand conservatism not as a static force to which it's conventionally associated, right? We think of things like attachment to caste, attachment to kind of feudalism, all of those sorts of things, which of course exist in Indian society. But it is about how conservatism is also remaking itself, just as it does in other societies, right?
So, and you're absolutely right about that. I think that the one of the most interesting thing about the book was it was so surprising in its structure, because I picked up the book and I expected it to be the history of the party from cradle to grave, as you expect, and the book covers that. But it is so much more than that, and it's such a interesting fusion of intellectual and political history in that way, and it's such a refreshing structure in that way. So let me ask you a quick question before we go forward, which is because I know that this came out of your PhD research, a lot of it. Did you set out to write an intellectual history, or did you set out to write political history?
So neither actually. My training and objective was actually to write a history of economic thought, but a history of economic thought that is not from Adam Smith to Amartya Sen or whatever, Adam Smith to Paul Samuelson. So it's generally a set of white males who are very influential in developing the history of economic theory. Rather, it was to take from the social history of ideas as developed by figures like Robert Darnton, etc., Bernard Bailyn, and to take some of those methods and try to understand ideas in practice, to understand thinkers who are operating in this intermediary stratum between, in between kind of intellectuals and ordinary people, right? And thinking about communication between levels of society of those ideas. And so the medium of transmission, print culture in my case, becomes, and then of course later on in terms of lectures, speeches, mobilization on the streets, those kinds of things become quite important in writing that kind of a history, right? So yes, it's a history of, I would describe it as a kind of history of economic ideas, but it is a history of economic ideas and politics. And to do so with social history in mind was the challenge.
And I think you managed to do it very well.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that you said earlier about that you're thinking about doing this also in a way to understand Nehruvian India more deeply, in trying to see it from a different angle. But it is very interesting that the first chapter of the book, the first substantive chapter of the book, is basically about planning in itself, to lay out the groundwork of what is the situation and then talk about what are the critics saying about that. But I thought that that one chapter in itself was very interesting, because I thought that I generally broadly knew the history of what the planning was, but the way you approach it, especially the socioeconomic changes that it brings, is very fascinating. And I think that in terms of just for undergrad courses, just assigning that as a reading, as an introduction to planning would be very revealing, because usually we only talk about planning the first three plans, which is the main planning era, as the story of failure, that overreach and failure, that by second plan there's a lot of success, and then by third plan it collapses. But you talk about how even though that failure happened on a planning level and its stated objective, it still transformed India in many, many ways, and some of them unanticipated. So could you talk about what are various ways that this was happening?
Yeah, absolutely. And Sandeep, I'm very gratified that you mentioned that, because this chapter actually took quite a bit of time to assemble. We have certain histories of planning uh, that have been produced. We have, people who've kind of worked in political science and have written about India's political economy. And then you've also got economists who have written about the experience of the plans. But as far as I was aware, there was no kind of potted, 1950 to 70 kind of, here's what happened in the plans. Here's how they kind of, embed themselves in Indian society. Here's how the kind of public responds to them, and then how does it kind of change India's social structure in various ways. And so that was effectively what we're trying to do. And the other part is that trying to do that in a way that's a little bit more engaging than kind of going through plan blow by blow. So trying to mix that with, think of this as part of, I mean, if we kind of go with Nikhil Menon as a this idea of trying to produce a kind of imaginary among the people, right? And to buy them into a certain kind of idea of, this is what the nation is, the kind of nation building. So it's to bring the nuts and bolts of discussing planning alongside some of the literature, some of the, from the films division, some of the, more didactic kinds of, propaganda that the state is producing. And then also alongside some of the criticisms that are leveled by people in popular literature. So, for example, the famous book Rag Darbari, or some of the work by figures in the Nai Kahani movement, film songs, all of that. So that was the kind of, but yeah, what happens during this period? I mean, broadly 1950 to 1965, right? So the idea is that, and this is often forgotten, particularly by economists who read things sometimes a little bit backward from today and look for breaks in growth. So India is, has emerged from the Great Depression and from World War II, right? Famines, etc. There's a sort of strong current of anti-colonial nationalism, right? There is the example of the Soviet Union that has industrialized in pretty quick order, right, through central planning, right? But it becomes pretty clear that in Indian circumstances, the Soviet model, right, while it's kind of inspiration perhaps in certain kinds of planning literature, this is going to be a mixed economy of public and private sectors, in which the public sector will really kind of shoulder the investment for and get kind of preferential treatment, such that we will produce heavy industries, right? And you want to build up your heavy industries so that you kind of become an industrial power, and you can kind of insulate yourself against some of the kinds of vicissitudes of global markets. Because in the early 1930s, after agricultural prices fall, the Indian economy is devastated, right? So you're a kind of price taker on the global market, right? A kind of a modified plantation economy, as it were, right? And so the idea is, just as America is trying to reroute their supply chain so they're not so dependent on China, and they're trying to build their own semiconductor chips. It's a similar kind of thing that's going on. And in a way, this is an interesting moment to kind of reflect on that. So there are protective tariffs for certain kinds of industries. India is very constrained in terms of foreign exchange resources. And a lot of the machinery that you need to buy for industrialization can only be purchased with foreign exchange because it's not made in the country. So you have to tightly control that foreign exchange and strategically allocate it to sectors, often in public sector industries. To private sector actors, you have to you have to basically license it, license case foreign exchange. Alongside this, right, the Indian state is taking on new responsibilities, right? It's no longer a colonial state. It wants to provide a modicum of welfare. So the fact that you have more economic functions being taken on and more stuff to kind of managed and distribute, right? That leads to the expansion of the bureaucratic class, right? So they kind of wield a certain kind of power, right? And of course, getting things like industrial licenses and that sort of thing for private sector actors, these things tend to accrue more to established players who have contacts with the government, that kind of thing, right? But at the same time, this is a period in which you do have the expansion of small and medium enterprises, right? You also have the expansion of literacy, people getting into the professions, migration from a kind of rural to urban India, the expansion of cities, right? So it's a really kind of it's a time of kind of profound churn, right, in Indian society. There are a number of achievements, right? I mean, obviously, we talk a lot about the IITs and we talk about the neglect of primary education. But if we just look at literacy and school enrollment, these are big changes that take place, right? And one of the things that kind of crops up is that some of the smaller and medium kind of business organizations that develop, they kind of cluster around particular communities, right? And also around regions. So the South and the West are regions in which become kind of that have, of course, long-standing histories of trade and particular kind of land relations, etc. But they are able to kind of pick up in this particular period, right? And that's not to say there are not other prosperous regions, but this is, these are the regions that kind of I'm kind of focusing on. So, but at the same time, of course, what happens is that the second plan is kind of overambitious. It relies a lot on deficit financing. By the end of the third plan, you have to go on a plan holiday. You've kind of quoted a foreign exchange crisis, right? All of a sudden now foreign aid, which figures maybe 15 to 20% of planned financing, starts to come with some strings attached, right? Given that it's the amount that's coming from the West is much more than from the Soviets, they start to impose certain kinds of conditionalities, like we want you to liberalize trade and all of that. And so there's a kind of crisis in the planning model, which is basically heavy industry-led import substituting industrialization. And so it's important to note, right, that if we had to look today and say India is not South Korea or India is not Japan, which is what a lot of people like to do, or India is not Singapore, it's very easy to kind of, to use an American phrase, Monday morning quarterback it when the game is on Sunday night. But if we're looking at the kind of profound challenges that are being faced by the Indian state in the 1950s, and you look at the fact that you move from a 0% growth rate to a 3.5% sustained growth rate, right, in a pretty resource-constrained country, there are kind of achievements of that particular period. Nevertheless, as I'm showing, it also courts a kind of discontent. And that emerges from the kind of interplay and kind of antagonisms, if you will, between some of these new professional classes, these new business classes, and the bureaucracy, right, who are the kind of representatives of the state. And it is that upwardly mobile set of people that produce the kind of discourses that around free economy, particularly vilifying the bureaucratic classes and their political overlords, that kind of forms the fulcrum for what becomes this critique of planned economy as free economy, and then the subsequent articulation of an alternative opposition politics.
Yeah, and you mentioned employing various books and movies and various other means of doing this. I remember there was a point in the book when you start talking about Ek Gadhe Ki Atmakatha, and
Right.
I thought that the title itself was very revealing about how this thing was perceived in some parts of the country. And I think this book is also a testament about the fact that despite so much focus on planning, we still do not understand so many aspects of it. And I think that not only through capturing the opposition, but even in this chapter, just talking about various socioeconomic churns that are happening because of planning, you show that there's so much more to be done. And it's very exciting in a way from a historian's perspective. But let me move on to the next question. As I said, that surprise has been a big theme of this book, that the kind of book that I expected, it didn't turn out to be that. And one of the ways that was that if I were to think about a book about Swatantra Party, the first person I would think of would be Rajaji, C. Raja Gopalachari, who was the co-founder of the party and also a very heavy hitter of Indian politics from 1930s onwards. At one brief moment also considered a potential successor to Nehru.
To
But
Gandhi, yeah.
to Gandhi, sorry, my mistake. But it is interesting that instead of that, you start your book with Lotwalas, the father and daughter duo Lotwalas. So who are Lotwalas, and why do you start your book with that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not because Narendra Modi is Prime Minister of India that I decided to start with two Gujaratis. But it's interesting. The Lot means flower in Gujarati. And the Lotwalas are a really fascinating family who become quite prosperous in the 1920s because in the late 1910s when they're supplying flour to the army bakeries in Bombay. They are flour millers who then kind of mechanize their the flour traders who kind of buy a mill and it gets mechanized, etc. So exactly this kind of transition from trading to enterprise, etc. And Ranchor Das Lotwala, sort of the second most famous Ranchor Das after the protagonist of Three Idiots, um, he is a man from the Halai Lohana kind of trading caste whose family has been in Bombay for a couple of generations. And he gets very interested in Arya Samaj and Hindu upper caste kind of reform movements, believing that caste is the original sin of Hinduism, and progressive social reform is quite important. So in the interwar period, he gets extremely involved with a number of a number of different kinds of political causes which are both to emancipate India from colonial rule, but also for the kind of progressive reform of Indian society, right? And so they sort of, but it is part of a Hindu revivalist strand of reform movement, right? Um, However, what happens is that he slowly kind of moves toward interest in more political economy types of issues. So he during the interwar period gets in touch with S.A. Dange, who is of course an early communist figure. By reading his book on Lenin versus Gandhi, and then he becomes a great patron of socialism in Bombay during the 1930s. And broadly, he keeps kind of following the currents of what's taking place in the West. And after, the Stalin Trotsky split and this sort of thing, like many others, like many, for example, in the United States, the kind of Trotskyists, they kind of move to the right, right? And so that becomes the way that he kind of ideologically kind of peregrinates and becomes a person who, very uh, becomes a person who's sort of quite concerned about the abuse of power by the state, precisely because of what's happening in the Soviet Union. Right. And so then he kind of moves toward a certain kind of libertarian anarchism, so to speak. And then he kind of forms his own kind of amalgam, which is called Indian libertarianism, and which of course accepts a nation state, but it is kind of libertarian in terms of its political economy. And of course, must not forget that he's a flour mill owner, so he's dealing with the regulations of the Nehruvian state, and it's kind of pinching him. By the 1950s, right, Lotwala himself is pretty old. And his daughter Kusum, his youngest daughter, who's a former badminton player and All India Radio broadcaster, a very dedicated, dedicated person, actually takes over his institute, which is the Libertarian Social Institute, and is running its day-to-day operations. He's kind of retired, out to the suburbs kind of thing. And so she runs this extraordinary magazine called the Indian Libertarian and sources a lot of libertarian, decentralist, anarchist materials, etc., from the West, which is a real labor of love, and publishes Indian Libertarian, hosts like runs a hostel which has certain kinds of students from Bombay University. It gives them kind of scholarships, has them write essays and essay competitions, and also most importantly runs the Ranchor Das Lotwala Foundation Library, which continues in Girgaon in Bombay today. Okay, I mean it's that's what the book kind of starts with. So this is where the discourse of free economy is born, right? And it is from here that a figure like Rajagopalachari picks up. I mean, of course, he has his own proclivities, ideas, understandings, as I discuss later on in the book. But this is where he picks up the language of free economy. And it is a kind of institute that sees itself as educating some of these new professional classes. It starts, one of their campaigns for membership says, you too can be an economist. And we're living in an economic age, right? Of course, the great battle between capitalism and socialism, or whatever, as embodied by Soviet Union and the United States, right? So this is basically what, and also very much conscious of the fact that we are fighting a very live battle, which is the Cold War, right? So a lot of Indian history is about, in this period, is about non-alignment, and of course, rightly so. But what's important to understand is that there is a current of consciously aligned people, both on the left, as you might expect, but also on the right within India. And the Indian Libertarian becomes a journal that is at the center of a connected cluster of associations and periodicals that exemplify that pro-American, anti-Soviet, anti-communist Cold War bent.
So, this is something that comes out in a lot of Lotwala's portrait, as you portray it in the book, but other people as well. Their intellectual journey is very long and complicated and winding and goes in all sorts of directions. So let me ask you, I mean, I know that you had these long, complex journeys because you wanted to bring out various strands of ideas that are working here.
Yeah.
But if I had to push you in terms of Swatantra Party, all these strands, anti-communism, anti-statist libertarianism, free market, laissez-faire economy, right? What do you think, how would you rank them in terms of what is driving and what are the things that are getting lashed on as ideas because it comes as a package? So what is driving a lot of this thinking, do you think, in the
Yeah,
party?
so I will say a couple of things. So just first on the broader issue of, why bother with long personal history of I started with Lotwala, I told you about his grain mill, I told you about the Arya Samaj. I mean, why not just talk about what he's publishing in the 1950s, right? There are reasons for that. The reason is that if we are trying to understand, right, in its complexity, but without getting too bogged down in all of the details, if we want to try to understand what Chris Bailey called this kind of unique amalgam of Indian thought, right? We have to kind of peel it back and basically build the layers from ground up. That's the way to do it. Methodologically, that is the claim that I'm making, is that you have to basically take apart these intellectual biographies and build the layers, and only then can you isolate and distill the kind of elementary aspects, as it were, right? And I think that kind of palimpsest approach, if you will, is important. Having said that, of course, Swatantra includes multiple kinds of people with multiple kinds of proclivities. But if I were to, what I've identified as 4 lowest common denominator features, I would say that they are anti-communism, right? I would say that it is about unfettered economic activity, right? Unfettered by the state, unfettered by and that in various forms. That's regulation, that is, quotas, whatever it is, scarcity, decentralization, right? So, in other words, rejecting the planned economy, right? And instead of that, thinking about different kinds of spatial configurations that are not basically one nation, things at the center, that is sort of the direction and way in which things go, producing particularly kind of profound regional imaginaries, right? And then the final thing is the defense of private property, right? So that is the kind of 4th pillar, if you will, of Swatantra's economic platform. Now, beyond that, there are ways in which people differ, etc. But I think that those 4 things are important, and they also distinguish it from what is sometimes called neoliberalism. because the most concrete and I think sophisticated articulation of neoliberalism, which comes from my friend and colleague Quinn Slobodian, right, is a project to insulate markets, right, from democracy and also from the state by passing a certain set of laws and rules of the game, right? This is different. This is not a legal project, okay? With the exception of the defense of private property. This is not a legal project at all. It's not about configuring economic activity or setting a set of norms so that markets behave in a particular kind of idealized way, right? There is no theory of, circular flow of goods or whatever it is that Rajaji is kind of looking at, right? He doesn't have a growth model in his head.
One thing about Swatantra Party that I had always heard, and you mentioned it in your book as well, the first way that Nehru dismisses and Congress Party dismisses Swatantra Party is just basically by saying that it is the party of big business and princes, mostly about princes. You kind of blow up that argument, and you say that there are very different constituencies which are actually making up the party, and not really just big businesses and princes. So, can you talk about who made up the party?
Yeah, so on that, so Nehru says that this is a 19th century party, it's a party of ghosts, blah, blah, blah. And I think the point is that, so if you were to look at the electoral returns of the Swatantra Party, there is certainly a case to be made that, look, in Gujarat, in Gujarat, you're getting votes from the Kshatriya Sabha. In Rajasthan, you're getting votes from effectively dispossessed zamindars and maharajas. So that is certainly a defensible vote bank style understanding of the Swatantra Party, right? But to purely characterize the party as that would be to misrepresent its history, and I think miss out the more interesting bits, right? Because if we actually look at the party organization, and we're looking at some of the communities that may not be delivering, tons of votes, but are delivering an MP here or an MP there, right? What is interesting is actually that it is communities like the Gaundars in Tamil Nadu, who are, of course, later on kind of associated with textiles. So landowning and dominant communities, Kammas and Reddys in Andhra Pradesh, Charotar tract Patidars in Gujarat. Right, so these are landed, of course, Parsis as well, landed and mercantile communities that are moving toward different kinds of industry, agro-industry, real estate, construction, what have you, right? And these, I think, are this is a very important thing to consider because it captures the political expression of certain kinds of communities whose political economy is changing, right? And they are finding a voice that is outside the Congress, right? Now, of course, many of these sensibilities exist within the Congress itself. And one of the points that I try to make that there are many ways in which Swatantra resembles the Congress, right? But rather than pulling the Congress in one way, as a party of, basically exerting a pull that you want to move the elephant, these guys are pursuing a different kind of strategy, and that's kind of significant for the history of Indian politics, right? And so, yes, and just on the big businesses and Maharaja's question, right? I mean, of course, big business supports Swatantra Party, but big business is also beholden to the Congress Party. So if Tata is giving X amount to Swatantra Party, he's giving 1.5x to the Congress Party, right? I mean, JRD Tata actually writes to Nehru saying that, look, I'm going to be making this contribution to the Swatantra Party. Not to say, is it okay? But, basically just, he said, yeah, that's fine. That's great. Good for them. That is not the behavior of a deeply subversive big business that is going against, the current currents of the time, right? Birla is very much in the pocket of the Congress government. And of course, Tata and Birla are a little different in that Tata is willing to countenance and support opposition. Birla, not so much. They don't have anything to do with Swatantra Party. So, big business itself has got heterogeneous strategies, right? Ambani's, Adani's today differ from the Kirloskars, differ from what have you, right? So it's important to understand that as well, and rather than think of just kind of. So it's a question also of, so it's also about big capitalist, smaller regional capitalist. That's part of the, because the big capitalist, in a sense, they're, yes, of course they complain. Of course, maybe they feel that, look, the state isn't able to provide them resources that they need. But they have basically cornered a very large internal markets, and they're getting preferential access to import licenses. So things could be much worse for them, right?
Yeah, and I think the book does a very good job of bringing out some of the histories of these micro histories of these communities, patidars and
Yeah.
kammas, and in particular, the whole history of Amul that you bring in, woven in with the Gujarati history
Yeah.
was very interesting. Uh, but this argument that there's this transformation happening in 1960s that is pushing them to these land holding castes, basically to look for other ways of representation and all. And this is this a response to fear of land reform? Is it
Yeah.
is it a natural outgrowth of economic shift that came out of Green Revolution? What are the changes that are happening, and what is it that Congress is not satisfying for them that they need
Yeah.
to go outside to look for?
Yeah. So the Green Revolution, I would say that, look, the Green Revolution story is later, right? The Green Revolution story kind of, you sort of initiate mid 60s, and really you're reaping the benefits by the 70s. So by this time, Swatantra has kind of collapsed. But I think there's a valuable connection to kind of think about that, because of course in the north they go with the Charan Singh group of whatever Charan Singh's party, and they get involved in Janta and all of that. But yeah, there is something that they feel is not being done, uh, because look at the strategic priorities of the Indian state between 1950 and 1965, right? It is not in facilitating the transition of these people toward kind of capitalist enterprise, right? Nor is it necessarily in providing remunerative prices for their agricultural outputs. The subsidies that you start to get in the 70s and that sort of thing are not what you're getting in the 1960s and the 1950s, right? So there is that. And then there's also the fact that these are regions, right? So this is not the kind of Hindi Heartland Congress, that kind of group. So you have regional leaders who have built the Congress in these areas who are kind of breaking away as well. And so there it is a question of like, well, who do you follow, right? So that's the other kind of dimension of this. So what is the Congress not meeting? I mean, Congress is actually meeting, insofar as they have not been able to produce serious land reform, right? The Congress is actually meeting some of these guys' requirements. Whereas if these guys were, if they pursue land reforms along the Chinese lines, these people will be reduced to shreds. But it's never about, things could be worse. It's about how happy are we with things as they are, and what do we feel is not being done. And so you have, price supports are not being implemented. Agricultural incomes are volatile. You have the fact that these communities are basically operating their businesses without the state. And when they encounter the state, it's not providing support for business. It's basically trying to regulate their activities, right? And then you have the fact that the leaders who developed and supported and built the kind of political capital in these regions are kind of on the wane.
At the risk of
And one
yeah,
last thing is
go
that,
on.
and also the some of the big charismatic figures that you have in these regions have shifted their alliances, and so they're kind of moving with them.
Um, at the risk of oversimplification, do you think a lot of it is basically a reflection of the first three plans ignoring agriculture and focusing too much on the heavy industry, and
Yeah,
that
so
being reflected in political?
it's not just ignoring agriculture, right? It is also the question of basically not providing a suitable framework or set of supports for small industrial development. But yes, I think the agriculture bit is dominant because particularly for agro industry, agricultural support is quite useful. Right?
It's interesting. I was really interested in the way you read certain things, because while telling this story, you also have an eye on a couple of social issues, and one of them was caste. It was interesting how caste kept popping up in very different and unexpected ways. One of the ways I really noticed was that there was a conversation about hereditary occupations, and how much you should stick to hereditary occupations or be free of it, which I imagine in some ways is about just imposition of caste hierarchy or not imposition of caste hierarchy. How is caste playing a role in this whole story of Swatantra?
Yeah, so the bit about hereditary occupation is actually a little earlier than the period of the Swatantra Party. So that's basically when Rajgopalachari, the Communist Party in the 52 election performs like much better than expected. So Congress has to form a coalition to form the Madras government, which is then known as the Madras state. Rajgopalachari emerges as a kind of consensus figure. He's kind of pulled out of retirement, right? And 1952, and is asked to take the helm over this minority government, right? One of the things that he does, so he runs this Madras government with kind of ruthlessly efficient administrator kind of and kind of as an authoritarian, right? But one of the things he's trying to do is to cut the deficit, right? And in order to do that, but he also wants to increase school enrollment, right? So a way to do that, he says that, look, everybody goes to school for half the day, and the other half the day they pursue their hereditary occupation. Now, of course, the problem with that becomes, if I'm a Brahmin, then I get to kind of hang out, right? Whatever, learn my mantras. If I'm a toilet cleaner, I have to clean toilets, right? And so I would say that there is, rather than overt casteism, there's a kind of caste blindness that exists. And Swatantra Party is not a party of the Dalit or the Muslim and that sort of thing, right? It is not a religiously bigoted party in the sense that it looks at the kind of minority as the other and that sort of thing. Some of the people who are involved with that are interested in a uniform civil code, etc. But where kind of caste plays in is in a kind of caste blindness. And they said, we want to focus on social and economic. We want to focus purely on economic issues. Well, those issues in India cannot ever be disentangled from caste, right? So the idea is producing a particular kind of class politics, right? And in so doing, blinding yourself, not paying attention to caste. And what that means is you reify those social divisions that exist in society, right? Now, of course, if you read carefully at a figure like Rajgopalachari, you see that there are a number of blinders like this. If you look at, and similarly, if you look at a figure like K.M. Munshi, for example, right? So while most of the Swatantra Party is actually, fairly in terms of their credentials is kind of Gandhian secularists, a figure like K.M. Munshi is, rather anti-Muslim, right? Now that doesn't make itself into the party platform. It's quite different from the Janasangh, etc. But there are certain kinds of idealized positions that are taken that are often quite blind to ground realities, which is because of the elitism of the party. I mean, they say that they represent a middle class. What does middle class in Indian society mean? They're not particularly clear themselves. They're trying to kind of create a middle class, which, if you look at the images that the party puts together, if you look at the kind of pamphlet literature that they produce, if you look at the kind of speeches, etc., in any way that you think about it, this salaried employee who's kind of comfortable in both their vernacular language and English, who's kind of reading and thinking, that is a very, very small proportion of the 350 million Indians that are living at the time.
And it was interesting, the similar dynamics also playing out on the issue of women. I mean, actually, in some ways, they are more explicit about thinking about women going back into the homes or their traditional role. And there seems to be a lot of pushback against the inheritance laws, particularly. So, how are they conceiving women in this economy that they conceive, that
Right.
they're
So,
thinking
so,
of?
so Swatantra like talks a lot about freedom of occupation, right? But it's so freedom of occupation for men, right? Um, and the women that are members of the party are all kind of hyper elite people, right? Leelavati Munshi, Maharani Gayatri Devi, these sorts of people, right? Um, and in fact, analogizing corruption to if the house is dirty, we must clean the house, right? I mean, that is the kind of rhetoric that you see. So the Swatantra party's leadership. So somebody like Minu Masani, for example, is totally okay with certain elementary ideas about gender equality. But if you look at the Bombay office of the Swatantra Party, the people who are doing the secretarial work are like generally women, right? Um, if you go to the streets in Kumbakonam, where they have these anti-inflation marches, they are appealing to women and saying that, look, you buy the vegetables in the house, the prices are increasing. Right? It's not that men are not experiencing inflation either, but there's a particular catering to the traditional household division of labor. Right? So that is how the Swatantra Party, in a way, has its, kind of it accepts the traditional gender division of labor. Uh, it's also worth noting that a figure like Rajgopalachari was against the Hindu Succession Act, by which the woman would inherit, half of the male, not even that much, right? Half of what the male of the family, born of the family, inherits. But that was something that he deeply, despised, and he said that, look, this is going to basically create fragmentation of families. The Kalki magazine, which was kind of his mouthpiece, ran a cartoon in which a woman is being pulled on one side by her father and the other side by her husband, saying that this is kind of splits the loyalties, right? So there's all of that is going on. So in other words, sometimes there is a sort of small constituency of kind of free marketeers in India who like to think of the Swatantra Party as really ahead of its time and at a party that is seized of so much foresight. I mean, whatever your views on right or left in terms of economic policy, uh, it's important to notice the very sexist imaginary that was, right?
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting that property rights were property rights for, as usual, for particular people,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
But so that made me think about this book, that in some ways, even though it is talking about free market economy and all that, a lot of the agenda seemed to be revolving around preserving social order.
Yeah.
And then you started the book with talking about how planning in some ways disrupted social order by bringing a lot of changes and a lot of churn in India. So can we think of also Swatantra Party in some way just a response to that social churn rather than economic or like the onerous state or something like that, but rather the social churn that is coming and kind of a defensive line against it by propertied, rural elites or the intermediate castes as they are called, like the whatever, the land holding caste or whatever way you want to think about it.
Yeah, and again, I think that's right. So I mean, the other community that is involved is the Tamil Brahmins, right? So they're all part of what Harish Damodaran calls India's new capitals, right? There, but yeah, so I think that's a fair comment. I mean, the definition of conservatism that I use is the old kind of Samuel P. Huntington definition, which is the one that's used in Howard Erdman's classic Swatantra Party and Indian conservatism, which is basically preserving or disrupting of the social order, right? And one of the things that came up in certain conversations about this book was, why are you calling them conservatives? And certain people who are like, no, 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 they're liberal. Certain people feel that, look, actually, urging a capitalist transformation in India, Sudipto Kaviraj said, look, that's a pretty radical kind of thing. But it's important to look at them relationally as opposed to what else is going on in town, right? So if the Congress is talking about planning and using the rhetoric of socialism and trying to disrupt or undermine the social order, right? If the left is doing what the left is doing, and the only people that are really to your right who have no real economic platform is the Bharatiya Janasangh, then like I'm sorry, but you're a conservative party, right? But I think it's important to ask the question about, is like what do we mean by socially conservative, right? So I think there are distinctions here to be drawn, right? Which is that there are elements within Swatantra, right? It's kind of social. So where Swatantra is like pretty consistent is around economic issues, those 4 points that I identified. But actually, you have more of a milieu of people when it comes time to things like social issues. Anglicized, westernized Minu Masani, the deeply religious Brahmin Siraj Gopalachari, K.M. Munshi with Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, right? You have some, this kind of Muslim prince from Agra. I mean, like, you've got quite a, this guy J. Muhammad Imam from Mysore. I mean, you've got people who are of different kinds. I mean, there's a guy called S. Ramanathan who's involved, who was, um, Periya's right-hand man in the self-respect movement until they kind of fall out about the Soviet Union. So, you've got people who have of varying different kinds of social proclivities. Yes, in the main, absolutely right. These are broadly, small c social conservative figures. But what I would say is that it would be hard, I think, to kind of put your finger purely on that, right? And that's why I kind of, I feel that the political economy story is the driving one, of course, rooted in certain social relations. But social conservatism doesn't quite capture what's going on.
I do want to connect it a little bit to the contemporary era, which is that this was one of the first major opposition parties that emerged and had to deal with the same political challenge that all Indian political parties had to deal with, which is how do you fight against the Congress hegemony? And I thought that it was very interesting that some of the rhetorical tactics that they talked about are something that BJP still clings on to. This idea of claiming a political lineage, which
Yep.
Swatantra did from Tilak to Gandhi to Patel, taking out Nehru from the picture and saying Rajaji is next.
Yep.
And today, again, clinging to Gandhi and Patel, but taking out Nehru and everybody else and, placing it next to BJP.
Mhm.
Or just the word Swatantra, the fact that the number of times India has had experienced some kind of Independence Day in the last since the BJP government came to power in 2014, there have been too many times India has been liberated in various ways, right?
Right.
So that like liberation from Congress and the
Yep.
idea that this is a which is something that the like far left also shares that kind of rhetorical strategy, thinking that Congress in some way the continuation of colonialism and all. So I thought that that was very interesting. Th- th-
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. No. Absolutely. So I think. So I would say that there are some distinctions to be drawn here again, which is that look, Rajgopalachari, N.G. Ranga, Minu Masani. I mean, these guys all went to jail in the nationalist movement. Okay, they marched alongside Gandhi. They had very serious uh, anti-colonial nationalist credentials, right? Uh, we know that the BJP, Bharatiya Janasangh, has a very different story, right? And I leave it at that because we need not, that could be a podcast of its own, right? And so so in one sense it is disingenuous, completely disingenuous. In the other, there is a clear genealogy, right? I mean, to draw a line from Gandhi to Rajaji is not the most far-fetched thing. This is a man who imposed basically ran the Gandhi ashram from 25 to 35 and was, worked very substantially on the constructive program, tries to impose Hindi in schools in 37, right? Maybe that's the only thing that he has in common in some ways with the BJP. So these are the kinds of things that, and so the idea is that, yes, the deviation is Nehru, and maybe that is something that is in common. But, the day that Nehru dies, Rajgopalachari says that, he was, what does he say? Yeah, he says that he was, 17 years younger than me, 17 times more beloved of the nation, etc., etc. And he kind of recognizes that, the person who has just fallen has had an enormous influence on the country, right? And so it's a very different attitude to what that figure is. But the idea is that, look, yes, in the rough and tumble of electoral politics, to say things about your political, enemy, is fair game, as long as it doesn't kind of go below a kind of belt. So to say that Nehru is, presiding over a corrupt Congress, etc., that is a different thing from saying that, you know, we are liberating the country from a certain kind of bondage. Now, of course, the point is that they do make with the terminology of Swatantra is that we want to preserve the Swatantra that we have fought for, right? And we worry about statism in the context of the Cold War. It maybe looks a bit alarmist now. We worry about statism going too far and what it can lead, and that's the check that we're providing. So absolutely, I mean, and they also repurpose a number of the symbols and tactics of the nationalist movement, which is something that continues to this day in this country across the political spectrum.
Yeah, no, my point was so just to point out that I think that the structure of Indian politics, because of Congress hegemony, leads towards a very obvious rhetorical strategies that are shared across opposition spectrum, regardless of where you're coming from, kind of thing.
Correct.
So, but we can go on this book forever, but we have also time constraints. So I'll ask one last question that I wanted your thoughts on, which is drawing from this. A book that our common friend Srinath Raghavan has recently written, Indira Gandhi Years, in which he makes the point that late 1960s, early 70s is this transition period where Indian politics is fundamentally shifting to something new from the previous era. And so, within that framework, do you see Swatantra as basically the last holdover of this old style politics run by anti-colonial old horses who has had their heyday, or it is something which is actually an early harbinger of this new kind of politics that is coming up about what, because it is positioned as this very interesting transition movement. Where do you situate it within the larger history of politics?
Look, I think it's a great question, and actually a very good one to kind of close on. So in many ways, people sometimes say, well, why didn't you get a Swatantra after Swatantra, right? Or why didn't it last? And part of it is because there's a sort of unique constellation of things that have to take place for Swatantra, which is really a very heterogeneous set of people and actors for that to come together. And I think that the experiences of the nationalist movement and the solidarities that has created really helps bring together people like Rajagopalachari, Aminu Masani, all of these kinds of people. And so in a sense, yes, it's maybe the last gasp of that order. So the Swatantra Party is as Nehruvian as the Nehruvian state, so to speak, right? At the same time, the arguments about the economy, right, and the communities, constituencies that get behind them, right, those endure. Right? Maybe not in the same idiom or whatever, but it kind of comes back. And so, for example, if we look at which are communities that have disproportionately benefited from liberalization, right? Tamil Brahmins, Patidars, Kammas, Reddis. By the way, a lot of them live in the USA now. So there's an interesting point, with respect to that sort of given the kind of pro-American orientation of Swatantra and all of that. So I think that's one way of kind of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is thinking about, yes, it's a national party, but it is a party that is concerned about the region and regional development and that sort of thing. And so if you think in some sense about the regionalization of politics, even though, yes, Swatantra is speaking in a firmly nation idiom, the ideas are in a sense being conceived of, etc., kind of projecting what's going on in the region or on the national canvas. And I think that is something that has endured.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you, Aditya Balasubramanian. We have been discussing his book, Toward a Free Economy, Swatantra and Opposition Politics in Democratic India. Thank you to Mohammad Yusuf bin Yaqub and Devyani Chaturvedi for putting this together. And we'll see you again in December with another edition of ISA's Bookshelf. Thank you.